Alrighty, welcome in. I'm going to be honest, I didn't think anyone was watching the videos. That's why it took so long to go from part 1 of the PIK bonds video to part 2 of the PIK bonds video. But there's been some requests for part 2, so we're going to do a part 2 here. And I guess we'll just keep going and part 3, 4, whatever. So today, again, and if you haven't watched the first video on PIK bonds or you're not familiar with PIK bonds, go watch that first. I'll put a link below in the video. Go watch that first. If you're not familiar with PIK bonds, this is not really going to make sense. So go watch that first if you're not familiar. Otherwise, here we go. Part 2. Today we're going to talk about toggle PIKs, and again, like many concepts, it's just like it sounds. It's very simple. So you're going to be able to toggle, the borrower will be able to toggle the payment type, payment form, or the payment at all on and off. So normally you'd have a periodic payment of, if you're doing a normal PIK bond, there'll be a periodic growth to the bond at the end, or like we talked about in the first video, or there'll be a periodic payment of more bonds or securities of some sort. With the toggle PIK, you would be able to forego a payment and you'd increase your interest rate. So you would forego a payment. I don't know how to spell forego. A payment in exchange, normally in exchange for an increased interest rate or an increased amount of bonds or whatever your payment is, but that would normally rise. And again, this would be done in the contract, done in the bond offering. The company would write in that they would be able to, skip payments at their discretion, and usually on the back end they would get an increased interest rate. The lender would get that in exchange for foregoing that payment. Also, it could be just the type of payment. So you could be switching, maybe you're switching between cash and securities. And you can do that at your discretion. You can toggle on and off. So either toggling the payment totally or toggling the type of payment. We'll give a quick example. In the RJR Nabisco transaction, which is the subject of the great book, Barbarians at the Gate. If you haven't read that book, I would highly suggest going to read that book. I'll put a note in the description as well. It talks about the history of that transaction, the characters. It doesn't go in really. It really doesn't go into detail on the financial structures too much, but it's enough and it's very interesting. So if you have any interest in this kind of stuff, I would definitely suggest going to read it. But even if you've read it, this type of thing wasn't necessarily in there, so we'll put it down here. So an example is that when a KKR, which was the buyout firm that bought RJR Nabisco, they had a debt mosaic. They had some normal bonds, they had some pay-in-kind bonds, they had some payment-deferred bonds. We're going to talk about the PIK bonds that they had. And this took place in the early 90s. And again, this is just for an example to kind of illustrate. So the way their bonds were set up, they were a form of a toggle PIK, and the way it was set up was it was a 15% paying bond. And the payment was either cash or more PIK bonds, PIK bonds. And this was at the discretion of the company / borrower. So that would be an example. A 15% paying bond, they can either pay cash or more PIK bonds, and that's at the discretion of the company. So that's kind of what they used. In this case, there was no increase in the interest rate because this is not necessarily foregoing a payment. It's just showing the ability to pick and choose. Certainly in this kind of a situation, you could write in that if they chose the latter, if the company chose the latter, they might pay a larger rate. If the company chose the cash, they might be able to pull this down a little bit. Okay, so one other thing that I mentioned in the previous video is kind of a teaser, and I'll just discuss it here, is the use of PIK bonds generally and the use of toggle PIKs generally, and why they sort of went away and then made a resurgence in 2012, 2013. The simple answer is the financial crisis. However you spell crisis. The reasoning is, like I said, generally PIK bonds and toggle PIKs, even more so, are going to be the most expensive and generally riskiest or the least amount of assets directly tied to them. So generally, I would just, for the sake of this, riskiest bonds. Not necessarily ways of financing, but according to bonds or within the bond universe, they're generally the furthest out there, the most expensive. And so in the financial crisis, we'll call it FC, many of the toggle PIK and the PIK issuances went to zero. So many of these issuances went to zero. So these deferred bonds, the toggle PIKs, all of these things, not all of them, but it's like if any were to go to zero, those would go to zero in a company's debt mosaic. And because of that, like anything else, people just backed off. They didn't write as much. And then in 2012, 2013, the wounds are healed and people tend to want to come do those deals more. I think J. Crew doing one for a dividend payment in 2012, 2013, a large offering was kind of the first in that to really mark the resurgence. So again, I'm surprised people are watching these, and I'm happy people are watching these. And if you have any topics you want to see or questions or anything like that financial related, just go ahead and throw it in the comments, and we'll do another part. We'll do a part 3. We'll talk about sinking funds, and we'll talk about some of the other ways you can structure the debt, and we'll kind of go from there. All right. Thank you.